Hello and welcome once again to Ivy English. I'm Karen.
And I'm Chris Gorski.
With the all-English version of Ivy English. Our title today is Castles, Fortified Structures, and Fairy Tale Inspiration. Now, if your head is kind of spinning, then you're kind of normal because before we started, I mentioned to Chris that I thought this was kind of a chunky title.
It is a chunky title, but our first word is clear. We're talking about castles.
That's right. When we say chunky, that means that it is very dense. It has a lot of very dense pieces and not a lot of connectors in the middle. So castles, we know what castles are. Fortified, you may know or may not know. That means that they're made stronger. Structures are basically buildings in this case. And fairy tale, that's easy enough. But then inspiration is just putting a lot of very contentful words together into a title. So first of all, we're looking at how they're built. And second of all, which is something we'll cover the second day, about their role in fairy tales.
Fortified is a word that always comes to mind when I talk about cereals.
Yes.
I was a big cereal kid, and hearing the word fortified, always a fortified cereal.
Fortified with 6 vitamins. And the reason they have to fortify it is because
There's a lot of sugar and processed junk.
They just processed all the nutrition out of it, so they have to put something back to make it somewhat worthwhile. But just a little tip here, do not eat cereal. End of story. Just don't eat cereal. It's too processed.
That is one of the things, when I go back to the United States, I go to the supermarket and buy like 6 boxes of cereal. I never eat cereal in Taiwan. I never do. I just don't care enough about it to eat it.
Yeah.
But when I go back home, I go into full-on yummy mode, and I love eating all my favorite foods as a kid, and I eat like a 10-year-old, basically.
And I think you are really, really typical because actually Americans love cereal, and there are many reasons for it. Of course, because it's nice and crunchy. It's got sugar in it, which keeps us addicted to it. And one really important reason?
Nostalgia for me.
Nostalgia is a reason for us oldies, but another really important reason is it's so easy to make.
Yeah, it takes seconds to get ready in the morning.
You just dump it, and that sound of the clinking, that tinkling sound of the cereal hitting the bowl, and then you pour in some milk, grab a spoon, and you're set. And that is just so easy. You know, if you're in a hurry to get to work or something, cereal is one of the easiest things that you can have. Not best, let me add. And it's to the point that, like, a lot of people, when they just don't feel like cooking, they have cereal for supper.
Or late night snacks. If I'm up late, when I was like a 20-year-old in the United States, I would open cereal and eat it. A very easy go-to snack. It's pretty cheap. Yeah.
As a snack, just eating it out of the box. But really, when you don't feel like cooking, if you've got cereal in the house, that's actually your go-to meal for many, many people, more than will admit it, I bet.
Probably, but either way, this has nothing to do with our topic today.
It has to do with fortified.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of processed foods, they try to put something back into it, but that's worth knowing because a lot of things that you do not learn from your textbook that you really should know are the associations that any given word forms in the head of a native speaker. And for Chris and me, it was 100% the same.
That's right.
That's right. So fortified, we're going to think of cereal, and that's why we got talking about cereal. So let's get going. Castles are ever present in fairy tales. However, unlike fairy godmothers and magical swords, castles do exist. Castles are private, fortified residences that are considered distinct from walled cities and palaces that are not protected.
Castles are especially prevalent in Europe, where the oldest date back to the 9th century. Shortly after the collapse of the Carolingian Empire, the territory was split up, and small regions became controlled by individual nobles. They built castles to protect themselves from attacks by neighboring lords. The fortified structures were also bases from which they could plan and launch offensive campaigns themselves. Castles were built along important roads and could control trade and the movement of people in a region.
The earliest castles were built from earth and timber. Stone later became the primary building material, but strong walls weren't the only feature that nobles depended on to keep themselves safe. Many castles were built upon artificial earthen mounds. Others were surrounded by moats, which were water-filled ditches and were only accessible by drawbridges that could be raised. Entrances to castles were often guarded by gatehouses, which could control traffic in and out of the structure. Inside the castle wall was a keep. This tower was the most fortified part of the castle.
Castles remained vital defensive structures until the 16th century, when they fell out of fashion for several reasons. First, new artillery that was powerful enough to destroy the strong stone walls was developed. While castles could be built to withstand these powerful cannons, they became uncomfortable and unenjoyable to live in. Additionally, regional conflicts and civil wars were ending, and in more peaceful times, nobles began living in more luxurious and unprotected country estates. In the 18th century, however, there was briefly a renewed interest in castles thanks to the Romantic revival of Gothic architecture.
And you are left hanging here because this is only part 1 of a 2-part article. We'll hear part 2 tomorrow, so make sure that you tune in then to hear the rest of the story. But for now, we're going to go over the part we have covered today, part 1. Castles are ever present in fairy tales. Now, note that fairy is a noun, tale is a noun, so we don't stress tale. It is a compound. We don't say fairy tales. What would that mean? The tale of a fairy. I don't know if they're an animal. So fairy tales is how we say it. Don't stress tales. Ever present, we got a little hyphen there. That means that any fairy tale you read, you're probably going to encounter a castle. Ever present means that it's everywhere. However, unlike fairy godmothers and magical swords, castles do exist. Many of the things that we read about or hear about in fairy tales were just inventions. They were dreamed up by somebody writing the story like Andersen or somebody else or Grimm. Right, but castles actually do exist. So this sentence tells us it's not just something you find in fairy tales. Castles are private, fortified residences that are considered distinct from walled cities and palaces that are not protected. So this sentence, at least for me, has the most important new information because I didn't know this. I knew there was a difference between castles and palaces. Palaces where a king lives, it's a place of royalty, and castles not necessarily. But this sentence makes it really clear what the difference is because I bet a lot of people don't know that difference. So first of all, a castle is a private residence. It's just like a big fancy house. And it's fortified, though. That means they've got very thick walls that can resist cannonballs and things. And they are different from walled cities. So maybe you've built a wall around an area to make a city. That's not a castle. And a palace, like I said, is a place for royalty. So it's making clear the differences between these 3 things that sometimes get mixed together.
Well, cannonballs, to be clear, were the end of castles. That was the thing that stopped them because those big stone walls couldn't stop gunpowder-fired artillery, and that was the end of it. But fire and dead bodies, those were the means of tackling a castle. Yeah, castles are my first love with history, the Middle Ages. And then the more I learned about castles, what was life actually like in a castle, what was life actually like during the Middle Ages, that's after the fall of Rome, roughly the Tang Dynasty to about the Renaissance, which is like the beginning of the Ming. Miserable. I would never in a million years wish I could go back to that time. What a horrible time to be alive.
So we had a very similar experience because we kids all grew up with fairy tales, but very early our teachers told us exactly what you just said.
Miserable life in a castle. Anytime you see those romantic shows about like lords and ladies, no. They're not giving you all the gory details. It's horrible to live in these things.
Yes, cold, leaky, drafty.
Smelly.
Very
smelly.
I didn't even think about that.
And many a time on Enjoy English School, I've discussed the way poop has influenced life. And people think like I have like this really immature obsession with poo-poo. And it's not that. It's that we all poop. And poop is a thing we have to deal with in our lives. And living in a castle without a place to put it, without pipes or proper toilets, it becomes a very real problem and a place for disease to build.
The fragrance would waft over to everybody in the building.
It was a terrible place to be.
The word waft means to drift, to blow around gently. We say it of smells or fragrances. So the smell was wafting through the room, or the fragrance, that's something that's nicer. It was wafting through the room. W-A-F-T, waft.
Great word. Let's continue on to paragraph 2 here. Castles are especially prevalent in Europe, where the oldest date back to the 9th century.
Right. So our fairy tales pretty much all took place in Europe. And that's how we, I think, learn about the land of the forefathers of many of us, those of us who have ancestors who came over to America from Europe.
Our next sentence begins, shortly after the collapse of the Carolingian or Carolingian Empire, the territory was split up and small regions became controlled by individual nobles.
Now, a lot of things came into my mind when I read that sentence. First of all, I thought life was very precarious. Precarious means it was dangerous, that something could happen at any time. Precarious just means that you're in constant danger. You don't know what's going to happen. It's spelled P-R-E-C-A-R-I-O-U-S. P-R-E-C-A-R-I-O-U-S. Life was very precarious because, you're living in this small place that's controlled by one person. You're not far from another place. And if the two start fighting, you're in the middle of the action.
So the Carolingian Empire needs a little historical context.
Yeah.
It's better known as the Holy Roman Empire. If you're to look this up, you're probably better suited to look up Holy Roman Empire. And that's where the action really was for these people. They began around the 700s, so think like the middle of the Tang Dynasty, and they lasted until like the 1880s. They were around a very long time.
And the word Carolingian comes from Charlemagne.
That's right. That's exactly right.
He was the head of it. So Charlemagne is the French version, and Carolingian is the adjective form that we use. So that's back in the Middle Ages now, just to place us in time. And you think of just these different small kingdoms. You read about these princesses and the princes and everything. These were very, very small, not countries, but they were just small principalities that people controlled and constantly fought over because they were trying to conquer more of them.
They were pretty miserable people.
That's right. Not a great time in history. And what it reminds me of is the period of the warring states in China.
Yeah.
Because that way you did not have a China before the first emperor of Qin. You just had a whole bunch of principalities that were constantly fighting. And a lot of your history and literature describes this.
I think that's a very good description of it. Let's continue on here. They built castles to protect themselves from attacks by neighboring lords.
Right. So if you're constantly fighting with someone, you're constantly in danger of being attacked. So you better be ready to protect yourself and all of your assets, your people.
Okay, so let's look at these two key words we have in these sentences. We have a noble and we have a lord. So you probably know the word landlord. Those are the people you would rent a house from. And a lord just means the person that controls this. It is not the same word as king. It would be inaccurate to call themselves a king. They are just lords. They're local important leaders by force of being the wealthiest and strongest family.
Basically a master.
Right. A noble comes from the word K-N-O-W. In order to be a noble, generally you were thought to be a smart person, and those were the other important, wealthy, powerful families that helped the master or the lord or the leader of an area.
Okay, next sentence.
The fortified structures were also bases from which they could plan and launch offensive campaigns themselves.
So what we're talking about when we're discussing castles is constant war.
Yeah. Let's continue here. Castles were built along important roads and could control trade and the movement of people in a region.
So now we have passports that will get you out of your country and into another country and then back again. Well, then you had to see how conditions were in the next principality. If they were not very friendly to visitors, you would have a hard time getting from A to B if you have to go through these hostile places.
Yeah, travel between places was very difficult at this time. It wasn't often welcomed, especially in smaller, more remote places of Europe. You were basically tied to where you were born, and there was no changing that. Becoming or being expelled from your city was a punishment worse than death for a number of people.
Nobody around to support and protect you.
And everybody else outside of those cities usually was bad news.
Beggars.
Criminals. Yeah, these were other people that were expelled for crimes. And so now it's dog eat dog.
Yep. Okay, next paragraph. The earliest castles were built from earth and timber. Earth means dirt. So you took dirt and wood and then used those to build these buildings. Stone later became the primary building material, but strong walls weren't the only feature that nobles depended on to keep themselves safe. So just earth and wood, it could be burned. It is not that safe. So later on, they started using stone. But this was not the only thing that they did to keep themselves safe.
That's right. In fact, I have a couple interesting facts, but I want to get a little bit further down because it gives us context.
Okay. Many castles were built upon artificial earthen mounds. So people would build a hill to raise it above the level of the rest of the land. So if it's higher up, they can shoot down and they can see enemies coming more easily. So really, it was all about self-defense. Others were surrounded by moats, which were water-filled ditches and were only accessible by drawbridges that could be raised. And the image that comes into my mind, besides the illustrations and the fairy tale books that I read when I was little, was games, online gaming. They love that stuff.
So this reminds me of Edinburgh Castle specifically because Edinburgh Castle was actually built upon an extinct volcano. It was like the highest place nearby. So it was built on top. And then they surrounded the land around it with an artificial loch. A loch is L-O-C-H. And a loch functions more or less like a moat, a little kind of artificial river built around it.
It's originally just the word for lake.
Yeah, exactly. And today it's all drained out and it's a beautiful garden, but that used to be all flooded with water. And every dirty thing that you had in your castle was thrown into the moat or to the loch. It was a filthy, disgusting thing.
I'm trying to imagine if alligators could survive. I don't think so. It's too far north.
No, too far north. They
dirty.
Weren't very dirty, not terribly deep. That whole idea of like alligators living in moats, not really based in reality because anything going in that water, you're going to die pretty soon of disease after. It was a very nasty place. Now, the word drawbridge and then that could be raised is a little redundant because draw means to pull here, as in to draw water or draw blood.
Okay. Entrances to castles were often guarded by gatehouses, which could control traffic in and out of the structure. So you didn't just come and go as you pleased. You needed permission. You needed a pass. Especially if you're coming from outside, you're not going to get in very easily.
So one of my favorite parts of a castle is just inside of the gatehouse. And so there's this little room when you go into a castle, and there are holes in the ceiling where you can drop rocks or pour hot liquid. There's an actual name for these holes, and the actual name for these holes is called a murder hole.
Anybody curious about its purpose?
Yes, what do we do with this? Why is this hole here?
Inside the castle wall was a keep, and this was new for me. It's something I probably should have known, but I did not, and this was really interesting.
But to be fair, this is an entirely logical thing. If you didn't know the name, you could see, okay, we have the outside wall, and then inside there's an even more secure area where all the most important people or important things would be. And that's called keep, because keep here is a noun meaning to keep protected or keep safe.
Right, and there's a little more explanation in the next sentence. This tower was the most fortified part of the castle. So it was the tower, that round tower usually that we see. It's not always round sometimes, but it's, I think, one of the first things we notice about the castle, and that was its purpose.
Now, these towers were often circular because it allowed for better fighting and the stairs could wrap around easily. Stairs inside of towers were always built clockwise because this gave the defender an advantage while they were fighting backwards. You were a defender, you were often backing up. Now, this clockwise staircase would allow you to use your right hand, and the person fighting you would kind of be swinging and hitting their sword against the wall, and so attackers were at disadvantage. But what if you were left-handed?
Yeah.
Well, it didn't matter because left-handed people were thought to be evil, and left-handed soldiers were forced to use their right hand, which meant they died more often.
All right. Even up until recent decades in Taiwan, a lot of kids who seemed to be turning into lefties, they would often be forced to become righties.
Yeah.
And
I had a little of this as I was a child, just a little of it.
And I'm wondering if that happened to my son.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Because we encouraged him to use his right hand, even though he was often using his left hand. So sorry, Eric, if that was really the case. So but I've noticed that has completely changed. A lot of my students are lefties.
I have some, yeah, and I'm always cognizant of it. Parents complain about where I put their kids, and I tell them, traditionally, you want to be on this side of the room. I'm left-handed. They're not going to see well from this side. Just let them sit here.
Yeah, there are lots of them in Taiwan now, which I think is a good thing. They're not being interfered with because it sometimes causes learning problems like dyslexia. At least some people have claimed that.
Okay, and just before we move on to our final paragraph, I got to share this. So castle walls were very important. They were hard to penetrate, but they were defeatable. Usually you just tried to starve the people out. You cut off the food supply. But you could actually destroy these walls before cannons. And the idea was you would dig a tunnel under the wall and use timber, wood, to support the tunnel. And then you started the tunnel on fire. That weakened the timber would collapse, and then the wall would fall under it.
Oh.
So how did you stop this from happening? Well, the people in the castle would dig an even deeper tunnel under the other people. They would carefully listen, hear where they were, and then start that tunnel on fire, and then have everything fall on them.
Gruesome. I can only say
it's a horrible way.
It's really gruesome. 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 That means something terrible and violent is happening. Okay.
It is time for our final paragraph today. Let's go. Castles remained vital defensive structures until the 16th century when they fell out of fashion for several reasons.
Now, I'm guessing a lot of people have guessed those reasons by now, the way we have been dissing castles.
Yeah, they had some problems. Let's take a look.
Oh, quick. First of all, diss, D-I-S-S, is to show disrespect for something.
Disrespect.
We're dissing, we're putting them down.
Our next sentence begins, first new artillery, that means weapons that was powerful enough to destroy the strong stone walls, was developed, cannons being the most important. Next, while castles could be built to withstand these powerful cannons, they became uncomfortable and unenjoyable to live in, and we already kind of talked about that. Additionally, regional conflicts or fights and civil wars were ending, and in more peaceful times, nobles began living in more luxurious and unprotected country estates.
So it is a real luxury to live in a place that is not heavily protected.
And this is where we start getting to palaces that you mentioned earlier that you did not know where the difference was. Power had become consolidated. The Holy Roman Empire was a big part of that, the Carolingian Empire that we talked about. And now these people didn't need to protect themselves. And in fact, not needing to protect yourself was a true sign of their power.
That's right. And a lot of things will progress faster when we've all banded together, and then we can help each other with stuff.
Let's continue. In the 18th century, however, there was briefly a renewed interest in castles thanks to the Romantic revival of Gothic architecture and our old friend Louis XIV.
And when you see Gothic architecture, you should have these really pointy buildings in mind, because that's the big difference. Gothic buildings are pointy, and Romanesque architecture is rounded.
And speaking of this kind of modern interest in castles, let's talk about Castle Windsor, which of course is the home to the British royal family. Now, interestingly, the Windsor family is named after the castle and not the castle being named after the family. And this is because the Windsor family actually has a German background. They were known as the Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. But right around World War I, German people in particular were not especially popular, and so they decided it was time to change their name, and that's how they got the name the Windsor family.
Really?
That's true. Now, Queen Elizabeth actually pays around 96,000 NT dollars a year in property taxes, even though she pays almost no other taxes at all.
That's another story in itself, I'm sure. But that's all we have time for today. Tune in next time to hear part 2 when we're going to talk about castles and fairy tales. So hope to see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.